Greetings, I'm Bill Klatke and I'd like to welcome you to today's edition of Neighborhood Beat. Our show today looks at the Public Justice Center and the various work that it's doing to help Marylanders have more rights and to lead better lives. Our guests today are Mr. John Nethercut, who's Executive Director of the Public Justice Center, and Alexandra Rosenblatt, who is a staff attorney with the center. First of all, John, if I can call you that, and I wanted to welcome you back after the previous show we did. Could you tell us a little bit about the Public Justice Center?
Sure. Thanks, first of all, Bill, for bringing the Public Justice Center back. We're always happy to be able to talk about our work. There's many important social justice issues going on right now, and particularly with this recession that has hurt so many people so badly. The folks that we're representing and trying to help need our services and others as much as possible. The Public Justice Center is a nonprofit law office. We represent low-income Marylanders on a variety of social justice issues, and we'll be talking about some of them this morning. Our objective is to use a variety of strategies. We litigate in the courts. We bring lawsuits. We also do quite a bit of legislative work. We always say if the law is not on your side, you need to go talk to the lawmakers, and that's what we do. And we also work a lot with government agencies that are implementing the programs that oftentimes affect our clients.
Great, thank you. Alexandra, what role do you play at the center?
I am a staff attorney in the Workplace Justice Project, so we focus on the employment rights predominantly of low-wage workers. We focus mostly on wage theft, which is when when workers are not paid adequately for their work in terms of minimum wage, overtime, which is time and a half after 40 hours in a week, and when simply they're not paid for all of the hours they actually worked. And then we also focus on employee misclassification, which is when employers illegally misclassify employees as independent contractors, thereby making them lose rights to certain benefits. And then most recently, we've been doing some health and safety work with workers.
Great, thank you, thank you. John, Public Justice Center has been around for a while. How long have you been?
Public Justice Center was founded in 1985. Mm-hmm. We've been around for 27 years now. And this, I will tell you that the Public Justice Center was founded in a time when there were a lot of restrictions on what legal services programs could do. When you go and hire a private lawyer, they have a whole range of legal strategies that they can use to help you. But with government funding, particularly federal government funding of legal services, there are a lot of restrictions on what poor people's lawyers can do. For instance, they can't, with federal funding, they can't do lobbying, legislative work, they can't do class action lawsuits, they can't represent certain groups of people. The Public Justice Center was kind of founded to do those kinds of cases that other legal services programs could not.
So you're a supplementary.
Yes.
At least an original.
Yes, and we're in the Maryland Legal Services community, for instance. The Maryland Legal Aid Bureau is by far the greatest provider of legal services. They represent more people on more issues. The Public Justice Center is looking specifically for what we call impact issues, strategies that we can change the law or a practice for an entire group of people. So instead of representing one client, then another client, and another client in the same problem, we look for strategies where we can bring one lawsuit or change a law or do something that will change the entire practice.
And how do you select those on the basis of whether or not somebody is not having their due rights?
Yes, we basically look at and listening to our clients and community partners that we have.
You're identifying problems.
Yeah, we're identifying problems and we're looking strategically for places where we can have an impact. So for example, if they're, well, and let me use an example that we'll talk about today is the tenants in foreclosure issue. And this is a good example of how we work. About 4 years ago, if a property was in foreclosure, the owner of the property has not paid the mortgage, the bank is now suing the owner to get the property back. And usually we think of these as being homeowners, as losing their homes in a foreclosure. But actually, and this may surprise you, about 40% of the people who are losing their homes because of foreclosure are not homeowners, they're tenants. They're renting from a landlord, and the landlord is in financial trouble with the mortgage company. And in a way, that's not surprising. If you're a small landlord, you have 4 or 5 properties, you rent out 4 of them, you live in one, you get into financial trouble, which one do you let go first? You let the rental property go first.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So the tenant in these properties, until about 4 years ago, actually had almost no rights, because they're not involved in the mortgage between the owner and the bank. When that lawsuit is going on to foreclose, the tenant actually was not even oftentimes notified of the foreclosure, and they didn't have any rights in court.
So they would get booted out that day.
Exactly. When the foreclosure went through, the tenant's lease was automatically canceled by law.
In the middle of the month or whenever?
Yeah, and even if their rent was all paid, even if they were great tenants.
That's unjust.
It is.
That's unjust.
And that's a perfect example of, we looked at that and we thought that's unjust.
Yeah.
But we did not have the right law, we didn't have any law to protect tenants. So we went to the Maryland General Assembly 3 years ago now.
Once you had received more private funding, foundation funding?
Actually, no, we did this without any funding initially. We saw the problem and we decided we need to fix that law. And so we went to the Maryland General Assembly, and Maryland actually led the country in this, in establishing that at least the tenant would be notified of the foreclosure action and be able to go to court and identify that, hey, I live in this house. At the same time, the federal government was actually passing some laws too, and we now have both federal and state law that say that tenants have the right to stay in the house after a foreclosure for whatever their original lease was, or for at least 90 days if they were like a month-to-month tenant. So for the first time 3 years ago, tenants in Maryland had the right to stay in the property. And the Public Justice Center, having been the lead advocate in getting these laws passed, now needed to start enforcing these laws. And that's where, luckily at that point we also got some more funding, specifically to enforce the tenant laws that we had now gotten passed. And we were able to do that.
That's great.
So the Public Justice Center now is one of the main organizations in the state of Maryland that will represent tenants when their landlord is in foreclosure.
And I know that the tenant issue is one thing that you're working on currently.
Yes. Actually, our tenant advocacy project has been one of our longest running projects. It's been going on really for like probably 25 years. We represent tenants both in rent court when they're being evicted for non-payment of rent, or where there are unsafe housing conditions. And the tenant then can file a case in court asking to escrow their rent or to hold the rent until the landlord makes the repairs. We've been doing that work for many years, and then just like I say, 3 or 4 years ago, added the tenants in foreclosure work.
Great. How can someone get in touch with you if they want to take advantage of that?
The best way is to call us. Our phone number is 410-625-9409, and just give us a call. We can, for most tenants in foreclosure, we'll first do a short interview and determine what their situation is, and usually we're able to just provide advice initially. One of the most important, over the phone, or by sending them some materials. One of the most important things tenants should do is make sure that the court and the bank who's doing the foreclosure know that they're there, because the landlord, the owner, many times is in default, many times has left. They've abandoned the house. They're no longer even collecting the rent. They're not making repairs.
They're
gone.
Money for stamps.
Right. They're gone. So the bank that's doing the foreclosure may not initially be aware that the tenant is there, and may not, and therefore not be giving the tenant the rights that they should be entitled to. So one of the most important things we advise tenants to do is write a letter to the bank and to the landlord and to the court to just to notify them that I'm a tenant, I'm here, I have certain rights, I need to be respected for that.
So maybe the net result of this is that the lesson that our viewers should take is that if you have the inkling, if you're a renter, that your landlord is getting into trouble,
Yes.
immediately call the landlord and find out the name of the bank
Yes.
and write the bank a letter.
Absolutely, absolutely. And if you call the Public Justice Center, we can provide like a form letter and steps to go through to find out where the house is in the foreclosure process. One of the real problems is that tenants are often being scared into moving quicker than they have to. The bank agent or a real estate agent may come around and say, the house is in foreclosure, you've got to get out. Well, that's not true. The tenants actually have rights to stay probably quite a bit longer. The foreclosure process itself takes a while, and then they've got 90 days to the end of their lease to stay. So it's usually not an emergency situation, but tenants can be scared into thinking that they have to move right away. One of the most important things we can do is tell tenants what their rights are so that they can make careful decisions and take their time and do what's in their interests rather than being frightened.
Yeah, well, this is very important. So with, as you said, 40% of the people being evicted are tenants.
Our tenants.
It's time that tenants get more aware of their rights and exercise their rights.
Absolutely.
Because otherwise, as I keep telling folks, you don't have rights if you don't use your rights.
Right, and that's exactly right. One thing that we've seen just in the several years we've been enforcing this now is that initially when these laws were passed, the banks didn't know what to do, the law was changing, the courts weren't quite sure how to handle it. It was all new law and new procedures. And one thing that we've been able to do over the last several years is by bringing a number of cases, we've educated many of the banks so that now they're sending proper notices, whereas before they weren't even sending the proper notices. We've educated more of the judges and the courts so that they recognize the rights of tenants when they come in. We don't have enough lawyers to represent every tenant, which is why it's important that tenants themselves learn what their rights are and be able to assert them themselves as well.
Yeah, well, that's a great accomplishment. But one that requires vigilance.
Indeed.
By those tenants, indeed.
Yes.
Alexandra, please. You are working on the Workplace Justice Project.
Mm-hmm.
How long have you been with the center? First
Very shortly. I've only been there since the end of October.
It's the end of October, so
Yes.
so you haven't even had your first anniversary. You're kind of you're still
No.
an infant.
I am, yes. I've been doing this work for a couple of years, but just at the Public Justice Center since the end of October.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure the center is
Yeah.
is better for having you.
Yes, I'm very happy to be here.
You mentioned the Workplace Justice Project, and there's several different parts of it. Could you focus on some of the things, the most important parts that would touch some of the folks that are viewing us?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I think the two main things that that I think that we focus on and also that people need to be aware of are the rights to minimum wage and overtime, and the right to be paid for all hours worked, and then the right to not be illegally classified as an independent contractor. So in terms of wage theft, or what's called wage theft, workers in Maryland have the right to be paid a minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. I think that's also the federal rate as well. In some states, there's a different minimum wage from the federal, higher than the federal.
Does that pertain to all work?
It pertains to hourly workers. So there's so there are salaried workers. If they make over a certain amount, they can be salaried. But hourly workers, so workers who work by the hour may not necessarily work 40 hours in a week, may work less, or may work more.
So
still
they could be
entitled
part-time,
to a minimum wage, right?
but
Yep.
as long as they're part-time hourly, it pertains.
Right.
The $7.25.
Right.
I better not tell my kids that.
So there's that issue, and then there's another issue, which is employees are often not paid overtime. So that means not paid time and a half their normal hourly rate for any hours beyond 40 hours in a week.
So that would be 10.80.
Right,
or
if
something
they're
like
paid
that.
minimum wage,
Right.
right? But it would be more if it was whatever their actual rate is, which is often more than minimum wage.
Right.
So in terms of what we do, we tend to focus on low wage workers, which in this sort of economic turmoil, as with housing, it is the low-wage workers that are being affected, the most, or most vulnerable in this economic downturn, and we've seen an increase in wage theft since the economic downturn.
Really?
Yeah.
Do you have any idea about how prevalent it is?
I don't have the numbers on me, and we're actually trying to create a report about that right now. I mean, the reports do exist right now. The National Employment Law Project has a lot of information,
but it's significant enough that it's happening in a lot of places.
Right, and then it's not only the individual worker that loses money, but it's also the state and the federal government, because then the employer is not paying taxes on any of that money too.
Right.
So it's certainly a public problem, not just an individual worker problem.
Yeah, and do you know why? Well, obviously the major reason why an employer would do it is to make more money.
Right, saves them money.
Yeah.
For the most part, there are fewer employers that will say they didn't know, but the law is pretty loose on the employer's obligation, or it's pretty strict on the employer's obligation to know. If you're going to be an employer, you have to know the laws, and that is to pay minimum wage and overtime.
Okay. So do you folks represent individual clients, or?
So like most of the other projects, we try to focus on cases that will affect either a group of workers or a class of workers, and or be in an industry where for example, these instances are very prevalent. So for example, in construction work, in landscaping, in restaurant work, minimum wage and overtime violations are pretty prevalent, and so we try to focus on either industries where we think it's most problematic, or where we think we can sort of cast a wide net and create change for a larger group of workers.
That's great.
And that tends to be most often construction and landscaping.
So you go into do you pick a case and file on that basis?
Yep. We try to collaborate with other organizations, with unions, with religious organizations, with community organizing organizations. And then we also do a lot of Know Your Rights presentations in the community. And so from those collaborations and from those Know Your Rights trainings and from networking, we find cases where either it's a class action that Maryland Legal Aid can't take themselves, or it's a group of workers where some of the workers or all of the workers are either possibly could have immigration consequences and are particularly vulnerable.
How can someone get in touch with you? Through the main number, the Public Justice
Through
Center?
the main number.
And that is, again, please?
What, I don't know it by heart.
410-625-9409.
Okay, great. And on the web?
Yes, at publicjustice.org.
.org. Great, thank you.
And then, so other than the minimum wage and overtime issues, there's also the issue of misclassification, and often people don't have any clue what this means. Generally, people have some sense of minimum wage and overtime, but what is another very prevalent issue is an employer calling somebody an independent contractor, saying, you're an independent contractor, therefore you are an independent contractor, even though the law might say otherwise.
And so you're not eligible for benefits,
Exactly.
You're not eligible for all the other
unemployment,
protections.
workers' compensation, minimum wage and overtime.
So it's another case of the state and the federal government are losing out on the taxes too. So we're all losing out on that.
Mm-hmm. And in fact, the Public Justice Center was a leader of some legislation that was passed a couple of years ago called the Workplace Fraud Act, which basically it allowed cases to go to court, but also gave the Department of Labor within Maryland the right to investigate and initiate judicial proceedings against employers who misclassify workers. But oftentimes employees simply don't know their rights, and so what we try to do is educate workers about what it means to be an independent contractor versus an employee. So things like it's all about direction and control. So can you control your work? Do you set your rate of pay? Do you set your hours? Does someone supervise your work? Does someone tell you how to do your work? If the answer to all those questions, or do you provide your own materials, your own tools? There is a variety of questions to ask, and if you answer yes to any or all of those questions, it's very possible that in fact you're an employee and not an independent contractor. So in other words, if someone else controls the quality of your work, your rate of pay, how you do it, when you do it, even though you might have signed a 1099, in fact, you're probably an employee.
And the employer is probably playing a fast one to avoid the
Right,
benefits.
and so they're not contributing to unemployment, they're not contributing to
Yeah.
workers' comp, they're not paying taxes on you, and people often don't find out until it's too late.
What can the worker do in that case if he or she suspects that they're in that situation?
Well, they can call the Public Justice Center with the number that John just gave. Also, the Department of Labor, Licensing and Regulation from Maryland, who has the workplace fraud, task or that unit that deals with that. You can contact them.
And they could
we
just
can provide them.
Google DLLR
Yes.
on the web.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And then or workplace fraud. There's a new unit that's investigating cases right now.
Great, great. And what do you see coming up? Do you have anything that folks should be aware of that's coming up, or do you have any need of volunteers, or how can people help if they get interested in this?
That's a good question. Well, certainly, so, like John said, we have the litigation piece. So we're taking cases to court and we're representing workers in individual or group cases. And then there's also legislation. And so right now, we are trying, we've this year introducing a wage lien law, which essentially allows an employee to place a lien on the property of an employer when they haven't paid all the wages that are due and owing.
My goodness.
Yeah. So we actually have what's called a mechanics lien in Maryland, which basically exists. If a construction worker, for example, works on a building and improves the building by 15%, they can put a lien on that property. So this is sort of an extension of that law. So we've got something similar on the books. This would give all workers, hopefully all workers, the chance to get a little bit, have some teeth, because oftentimes what happens is even when they file a claim, it's hard to collect on a judgment against an employer.
Why?
Well, that's a good question. There's some employers will close down their business and open up a new one and try to evade any sort of judgment or debt.
Because it involves not only paying that person, but paying probably a pretty sizable federal and state unemployment insurance, et cetera, bill that probably is compounded because they've been doing this on more than one employee.
Right.
Yeah.
Or they simply ignore the judgment, or they, just find some way to leave, go to another state, go to another country.
How could they ignore the judgment? I mean, aren't there sanctions that I guess you'd have to go to court again?
Yeah, actually, in the worker context, this is true, but in other areas as well, consumer issues are much the same, in that there are a number of companies, and they tend to be small and low level, but they employ a lot of people, and they may have a lot of consumers, and oftentimes, if they're violating one law, they're violating others. They're not paying their workers. They're not giving their consumers the rights they should have. They may not be paying their landlord. Businesses like this definitely do exist, and they have learned the corporate shell game well enough so that they go out of business when they get in trouble, and then they pop up again as another business name, as a different corporation, and it's a way to avoid liability for breaking the law, and a lot of people get hurt as a result. And we spend a fair amount of time chasing them.
Yeah, but I guess so a mechanics lien becomes all the more important.
Yes, and
because
that's
they can take their tools with them.
Right, and so
corporation.
the idea in some of these laws is for the worker to be able to get a hand on the property before it disappears. The corporation may disappear, the owner may disappear, but at least if you can freeze the truck or the tools or something that then can be used to pay the worker's wages, that's what we're really seeking. Most of these issues that we're talking about, tenants, workers, it has to do with kind of basic fairness and rights that people have, but are not able to enforce. And some companies have figured out how to get around that.
I was going to say, we're talking about very basic stuff that people get paid what they're supposed to be paid. People are classified as workers as in the proper classification. I mean, we're not talking radical stuff here.
No, not at all.
We're not talking, radical income redistribution or any of that kind of stuff. We're talking basic fairness here.
And it's basically the idea of an agreement or a contract when you're
And
working.
people living up to it.
The worker is working, they should be paid what they have agreed to be paid.
I think anybody would agree with that.
For a
And I would
tenant
hope.
in a renting from a landlord, it's a two-way deal. The landlord is obligated to provide a decent house, and the tenant is obligated to pay the rent.
Indeed, it's a matter of contract, as we
Yeah.
say. We've just got about a minute or so left. Could you, John, tell us, I hope folks viewing this would want to know how they can help. How can they help?
In a number of ways. Lawyers in particular, we can always use to help us on some of the cases. We co-counsel cases with other lawyers. We're a small organization. There are only 21 of us. We have 12 lawyers. So for some of these big cases that we're talking about, we need help from other lawyers who can volunteer their time or work with us. Individuals can, of course, contribute to the Public Justice Center. We always appreciate donations. We are a 501c3 charity. We receive very little government money, so it's mainly individual and foundation donations. And you can follow us on our website, Facebook, and we can connect you up with some of our causes and issues.
Great, wonderful, wonderful. And could you give us that contact information one more time?
Sure. It's the on the internet, it's www.publicjustice.org, and our telephone number is 410-625-9409.
Okay, one more time, please.
410-625-9409.
Great, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We're just talking basic fairness here. Public justice. Maybe you should change your name to Basic Fairness Center, because that certainly is what you're working on, and I would certainly think that anybody viewing this show would agree with that. We're not talking about anything that is not so totally, not even just American. We're just talking about common decency here.
Thank you, Bill.
And thank you for what you folks do to work and to try to correct some of these problems. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today in Neighborhood Beat. I want to thank our guest, Mr. John Nethercut, who's Executive Director of the Public Justice Center, for being our guest today. Thank you, John. And I want to thank Alexandra Rosenblatt for being our guest today. Alexandra, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Keep up your good work for all of us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And also for you, John. Let's keep fighting out there.
I will.
Keep fighting out there. For Neighborhood Beat, that's all we have time for. I want to thank you for tuning in. Let's try to be a good neighbor out there in all of our neighborhoods, and we'll see you next time.
Right.